Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our Year 1 DESE PBIS Academy team training video for November by any PBIS. I'm Eric Mackey.
And I'm Christine Downs.
And we'll be facilitating this video. In this video, we'll continue our overview of PBIS. We'll also continue with our getting started steps, focusing in on steps 2 through 4, such as developing a statement of purpose, identifying school-wide expectations, and developing teaching procedures. Your related tasks are to focus your efforts as a team on developing a statement of purpose, developing school-wide expectations, developing a teaching matrix, and developing a plan to implement a personal matrix, which we'll be discussing later on. In the meantime, don't forget about all these resources that are available to you, such as the school-wide PBIS workbook and appendices. These you can find on the nepbis.org website. It's handy to have them downloaded and available on your computer. I like to reference them in between these sessions. Make sure that you have your action plan. It's really helpful if your team has one action plan, maybe on a Google Drive or a Dropbox, that everybody can access it at one time and make edits. And then we have some of our favorite websites, such as, surprisingly, the nepbis.org website, PBIS.org, and PBISapps.org. So during the team session, we focus some time talking about the composition of your team. Remember, you want to make sure that your team is representative of the composition and roles within your school. This helps with buy-in to PBIS and the cultural appropriateness of your efforts. Take a moment to consider your team and who is on your team. Do you have teachers across departments or grade levels? Do you have administration represented? Do you have related staff there? Students, families, community leaders? Do you have mental health providers, community mental health providers who can be involved in your team? If one of those or more of those key stakeholders is missing, who could you invite onto the team? You want to make sure that that's a team process and decision before you go off inviting. Also, are there other teams within your school who are doing similar work? If so, you might want to consider coordinating with that team, making sure that there's somebody to play a bridge between those teams, or potentially merging those teams to reduce redundancies. Make sure to discuss this with your team or to jot down some notes you can bring to your team for your next meeting. All right, so moving back to our school-wide PBIS overview. Let's talk for a moment about why it's important to get key stakeholder input. We do this because we need key stakeholder input for their buy-in. Think about it. Are you more likely to do something when you're involved in that being developed? Most likely. We also do this to ensure that we maximize on the resources available to us through students, parents, and community members. We also get key stakeholder input because their feedback helps us to make sure that our values and our products represent the values and perspectives of our unique school community. Given this information, whose feedback do you want now? Any new additions to your team? As a practice, we want to develop feedback loops where the PBIS team is constantly gathering feedback from the broader community to integrate their ideas, viewpoints, and suggestions into the PBIS practices. This cycle of information is driven by administrators who are invested into PBIS and who advocate for its use, as well as the data that the team gathers. As you move along through the academy, you'll learn about assessment tools that you can use to gather feedback from staff, students, and families. These tools can help you to prioritize outcomes and the resulting tasks for your action plan. That's not to say that you absolutely need to use these particular tools. Teams often gather feedback from key stakeholders by strategies such as inviting them to team meetings, using informal surveys like Google Forms, gathering feedback on parents' nights, and so forth.
And some schools even do focus groups with families.
Oh yeah, great example.
Yep.
So take a moment and pause the video. Think about how your team can collect information from the key stakeholders groups that you're involved with. It may help to consider who are your key stakeholders. Sometimes it helps to think about who your work will likely impact. Also think about what information do you want to get from those key stakeholders and how will you get that feedback. Jot down some notes and bring them to your team at your next team meeting. So let's get back to our getting started steps. We talked about establishing an effective leadership team. Now let's focus on a brief statement of purpose for your team. It may sound silly, but having such a statement of purpose helps to keep your team focused and clearly delineates how this team is different from other teams within the building. So we're going to focus on how you can craft the statement of purpose. So the basic things that you want to do around your purpose statement is make sure that it's positively stated. So what are you going to do? What are you working towards? You want to keep it relatively short. It only has to be 2 to 3 sentences in length. You want to think about how your work is going to be supportive of the academic achievement, social emotional needs, and the behavioral health of all students, not just the students on IEPs, not just students with language needs, and so forth. This is tier 1. How are we meeting the needs of all students? When developing your statement of purpose, think about what outcomes you're seeking, such as school culture, climate, equity, college and career readiness. Also think about what has been identified as priorities within your school and in your district improvement plan. Also, what other teams exist within your school? How is this team going to be different? If it's not very different, maybe you should combine groups. Here are some examples and non-examples of purpose statements. Good example here: ensure all students develop the behavioral, social, and emotional skills to be effective learners through the implementation of evidence-based interventions and use of data to inform decisions. A non-example: our school will rock. Absolutely it will, but how are you going to get there? We'll have a positive climate. Again, we like that, but how? We'll improve the school. Yes, but how? And what are we improving? So what do these things mean? It doesn't have to be long. Again, 2 to 3 sentences, but we do need a little bit of elaboration. So your team spent some time during our last meeting working on your behavioral purpose statement. Take a moment to pause the video and to see if you can find that draft. If not, jot down some notes about what you imagine your team's purpose statement to be. Bring your notes to your next team meeting. If your team is starting from scratch, it's helpful to look at your school improvement plan, your school mission statement, or other mission and vision related documents, which can help to give you some focus and some phrasing.
Hi, everyone. You have probably seen this triangle before, right? It's the same triangle that we use when we talk about response to intervention, otherwise known as RTI, multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, and PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports. It's all the same triangle using all the same principles. Now, what does it mean exactly? So, we presume that if we provide evidence-based interventions, either academically or behaviorally, to all students, 100% of those students, about 80% of those students should respond and won't need any further intervention. We call that tier 1 or school-wide or sometimes universal interventions and prevention. Everybody in the school gets it. But we know, right, and we definitely have the academic example, that there will be a portion of the population, usually or somewhere around 15 or 20%, who definitely need a more targeted approach. They need a targeted intervention to help them. So these students might need a short-term small group to address their needs. They might need additional feedback or additional reinforcement so that their behavior is more similar to their typical peers, right? Please note that they still are getting tier 1. We don't ever remove that. And once the students show that they don't need that additional layer of intervention anymore, we peel that layer away and they continue to get tier 1. So think academically, A student might struggle with one particular concept. We have them come in at lunch or after school. We help them with that concept. Once they understand it, they move right back with their peers and just continue to come to class. Right? So even with that, there will still always be a smaller group of the population who are going to need more intensive individualized interventions. We assume that it will be around 1 to 5% of the population. So this population with tier 3 needs will receive the tier 1 interventions and preventions, the tier 2 intervention supports, and additionally their own individualized interventions. So it's layered. If they show they don't need a particular tier 3 intervention anymore, we'll peel that layer away, and so on. It's important to always refer to students needing tier 2 or tier 3 supports rather than calling them a tier 2 or tier 3 student, because we know all people have skills that they are sort of in the tier 1 realm and others tier 3. So remember, primary prevention is for all students. Secondary or tier 2 prevention is for some students. And tier 3 prevention is for that small group of students who need individualized supports. Think about how your students and staff are grouped within the building and which students would tend to need more supports. So we generally roll out tier 1 to the entire school together. However, for you secondary schools, especially high schools, it may be more reasonable to begin with your incoming grade, because research has shown that freshmen account for the highest rates of office referrals, course failures, and attendance issues. In fact, students' performance in 9th grade can actually determine whether that student graduates or drops out of high school. And we know that strong support and early intervention can dramatically improve outcomes for at-risk students. So here are some freshman facts just to share. Research has indicated that students are 3 to 5 times more likely to fail a 9th grade class than any other grade. In a large multi-school study, 25% of high-achieving 8th grade students were found to be off track by the end of their 9th grade year. The National SWPBIS database, which tracks office discipline referrals, has demonstrated that 9th grade behavioral infractions in high schools across the country dramatically outnumber those of students in the upper grades. Also, lower attendance during the first 30 days of 9th grade is a stronger indicator that students will drop out than any other 8th grade predictor, including test scores, other indicators of academic achievement, or age. And lastly, students who fall behind in 9th grade have a 58% lower graduation rate than students who are able to stay on track during the 9th grade year. So it's really important to focus on the 9th grade because it's such a critical year. And here are some references for those facts, if you want to look into them further. So when we talk about supporting freshmen, what do we mean? What exactly are protective factors for freshmen? As you can see here, it's about helping freshmen connect to the school, its culture, the staff, and fellow students. Having a strong freshman orientation or visits to the high school during 8th grade can help students feel a basic connection to the school. It gives them an opportunity to see the layout of the building, learn where the cafeteria is, how the lockers are set up, and other physical features of the building. Some high schools even hold activity fairs during freshman orientation to help students find clubs, sports activities, and things like that that they might want to participate in. Orientation and visits can also boost positive relationships between incoming students and staff and upperclassmen. Mentors or guides in the form of upperclassmen can help to give incoming freshmen the ability to meet those other students and staff in a less threatening way. Some schools provide summer or welcome back picnics or barbecues to give students a chance to meet their teachers and new peers outside of that academic setting. And it can help staff to see students as a whole person rather than just their academic ability or behavior in their class. Right? So be sure to speak to upperclassmen to see what they would have liked to know as freshmen and what other knowledge or skills you can provide to the incoming class to help them succeed. Also, ask those incoming students what they are most concerned about and what questions they have, so you'll know what to provide to them to ensure their success. So keep in mind, I am talking about freshmen, but if you are as ninth graders, but if you're an 8 to 12 building, obviously this applies to your incoming eighth graders, right? And these 5 areas are most effective with supporting those incoming freshmen or students. So consistent implementation of PBIS, which you're beginning to do, with active teaching and acknowledgement of behaviors that you want to see. Emphasizing the effective classroom management skills with your freshman teachers, such as having them greet students at the door, give clear reminders, create clear routines that are taught to students, and giving high rates of positive feedback. Be sure to teach students the organizational skills they need to succeed and provide them tools to help them stay organized and focused, such as planners or study packets. They might not even know that high school graduation is dependent on credits that they accumulate by passing classes. So be sure to explain to them how that works. Right? Be sure to utilize upperclassmen. Like I said before, peer coaches, mentors, tutors, and tour guides all serve to blend your student body and reduce that anxiety for freshmen. And definitely review your data and disaggregate it by freshmen on a regular basis. Be sure to look at freshman attendance, grades, and behaviors such as tardy to class or skipping class, and address those academic issues early before students fall too far behind. So take a moment now to pause the video, especially if you're a secondary school, and discuss what's currently in place to support those freshmen or incoming class. How can your team enhance or build upon those supports you already have or develop new supports within the PBIS framework? And what needs to happen in order to align those supports in your school? Okay. Now we're going to move on to identifying our school-wide positive behavior expectations. Sometimes they're called core values. So PBIS at its core is all about creating a consistent, structured, and positive environment where students feel safe to learn and explore. And an environment that's not welcoming, like this one in this example, no food, no weapons, no drugs, no backpack. It's just all no's. Will probably push students away rather than embracing them into the school culture. We really want our signage to be positive, right? Be safe, be respectful, be responsible, nice, bright colors, very welcoming. And this is actually a Massachusetts high school. So when you create your expectations or core values, if you don't already have them in your building, here's some guidelines you should consider. First of all, make sure they're linked to the school culture and the social culture of your school, right? Are you using language in your expectations that is universal to everybody, or might it inadvertently be based upon the dominant culture and not include the diversity of the student body, which is really important? They should be about 3 to 5 in number, no more than 5 typically. And they should be stated briefly in about 1 to 3 words. So something like be safe, act responsibly, things like that. They should be stated positively, right? We want to be clear about what we want students to do rather than what not to do. especially when we further develop these expectations and define them. Because we don't teach by telling students what not to do, right? We don't tell students 2 + 2 is not 5, 2 + 2 is not 7, right? We teach them by giving the actual example, 2 + 2 is 4. Additionally, we want to be comprehensive in scope and cover many different areas, but with minimal overlap between expectations. So for example, having an expectation of be responsible and be accountable might be a little too similar. So here are two really good examples. Now, schools often like to use acronyms, but it is not necessary to either use an acronym or to force it into your school name or something like that. If you do want to use an acronym, you can do something like connecting to your school mascot, like this one. Their mascot is the Huskies. So they say BARK, right? Be punctual, act appropriately, respect self and others. So it spells out BARK, something easy to remember. But you could even just create a simple acronym around a general behavior like caring, right? Students at Springwater care, right? And you can see the expectations here. Right? So some schools totally avoid the whole acronym thing altogether and simply go with something like be safe, be respectful, and be responsible, like we saw in that other example. Either way, it's fine. Don't spend too much time getting caught up in the whole acronym thing, though. Okay, so now you can pause the video here and discuss what current expectations or core values you already have in your school, because a lot of schools already have them. But definitely ask yourself, are they already in use? And do people like them and use them, right? Often we've had teams say, yeah, we already have them, but the staff and students have a bad taste from years past about them. Think about, do you want to create something totally new and make it more culturally appropriate to your school? Discuss how you will include students and family and staff into choosing your school expectations, right? So one way schools often do this is that the team will come together and generate a pretty extensive list of different expectations or values they want to use. Then they give it to students and families and staff, and they ask them to sort of check off their top 3 to 5 that they think they should use, submit it back to the team. And then from there, the team will choose the final expectations that get the most votes and don't overlap, kind of thing. And then everybody knows that they had an opportunity to provide input, like Eric said before, giving them more buy-in. Okay, so pause the video. Now we're going to move on to develop procedures for teaching those expectations. Specifically in this portion, we're going to talk about defining your expectations. So once you decide on those final expectations or core values, you're going to begin to define them by location or routines throughout your school, such as cafeteria, hallway, classroom, or arrival, dismissal, things like that. So creating a school-wide matrix is a really efficient way of operationally defining what your core values will look like across all of your routines and settings in your building. When you define them, and that's basically filling in these boxes between the setting and the expectations, you want to really be specific and concise. You don't want full sentences, just a couple of words that are clear, right? Follow directions and procedures, walk directly to the cafeteria, wait your turn, things like that. And if you use the acronym OAT, O-A-T, for each item, it will help you be more clear. And that stands for observable. Can I observe somebody waiting their turn? Sure, I can. Is it A, acknowledgeable? Can I acknowledge somebody for using appropriate language? Yes, I can. And is it teachable? Can I teach someone to say please and thank you? Of course I can, right? So That's what we want to do rather than just saying something like, be respectful. We want to be very clear. Saying please and thank you is something that's more specific. If one of your descriptors is too conceptual, like use a growth mindset, you're definitely going to need to clarify that and define what it looks like. And you might need to create a separate lesson to teach that concept. Sometimes even use your good line skills in the hallway. Even that, you might say, well, what are our good line skills? That might need to be a separate lesson. For you high school folks, you may also want to incorporate some of these college and career readiness concepts into your matrix, such as critical thinking, engagement, like we said, mindset, learning processes, interpersonal engagement, and some transition knowledge. Right? And you can embed those college and career readiness concepts right into your matrix. But if you really want to highlight the importance of these skills, you can create its own expectation or value, such as here, ready to succeed. And you can kind of embed them into that one. And once you create your matrix, it really easily translates into a lesson plan, which we'll get into in our next session. But it gives you the actual social skill that you want to teach, the context or location that you're going to teach it in, and the specific behavior example all in one place, ready to teach. Okay. You're definitely going to want to consider what you might need to add to your matrix beyond traditional behaviors because of this new pandemic reality, such as disinfecting, wearing a face mask, taking temperatures, things like that. You also want to adapt or create a second matrix for remote instruction. And for some of you, you might create this first because that's the reality you're in. Some of you are back in person, or some of you are in hybrid, so you might do a mix. Right? And here's a good example from a high school matrix for distance learning. For more examples, you can go to our exemplar repository on PBIS.org, and that would be in the Tier 1 school-wide drop-down menu, and it'll say exemplar repository. You can also go to PBIS.org for lots more examples. So again, take a moment to pause the video and begin to draft your school-wide teaching matrix. Write in your school-wide expectations down one side and your locations across the top, and then fill in your various behaviors. I find sometimes it's easier to think about all the behaviors you want students to follow in the cafeteria or hallway or wherever. And then once you have them written down, then place them into the correct box. It's usually easier that way. And again, 2 to 3 observable, measurable, acknowledgeable, and positively stated behaviors for each box. It might take some time. Think about where you want to start and what other areas you might want to get to later in the year.
So when you're developing your matrix, this is a key opportunity to gather feedback from your school community. If you develop your matrix in isolation, never checking in with students, teachers, and parents, you run the risk of developing values and expectations that are culturally tone deaf, especially if your team isn't necessarily representative of your local community with regards to race, ethnicity, and culture. You really want to make sure to get your community's input. That's to make sure that you're incorporating the values of your entire school community, to make sure that you're not maintaining the status quo just because of tradition or generic Western standards. And we want to make sure that your students and faculty have a chance to provide their voice and choice into the expectations. Again, this is how we garner trust and buy-in around our PBIS efforts. So here's a nice example. The Lindsay Middle School incorporated student feedback into their values. Their acronym is SWAG. G stands for Guide Me. Notice how there are expectations for the teachers to supervise the students, arrive on time, and be prepared for class. This helps to keep the teachers accountable. This is like a contract between the teachers and students in order to build and maintain trust. A wonderful activity you can do to embed your school's culture and values into your school is to ask students to create their own matrix, but to identify the behavioral expectations for their own community and for their home, because they might be slightly different than what we have within our school community. But hopefully we'll find a lot of alignment. Here's an example of a completed student matrix. Remember, this is to obtain feedback for the development of the school-wide matrix, and we're thinking about this in terms of themes that generate from multiple students filling this out. Notice the similarities and the differences based on the context. We want our school culture and values to align as much as possible with students and teachers' community and home values. With that said, there will be some discordance at times. Expectations that may be appropriate at home or hanging out with friends may not be the same as the expectations in school. So when the behaviors are different, we want to think about whether our school rules need to be different. If not, then we can change our school behavioral descriptions to mirror those of the home and for the broader community. If they do need to be different, we need to make sure that we acknowledge the difference and make sure that we are providing solid teaching, practice, and rationale to bolster that skill and that code switching. So here's an example of when the school rule needs to be different. At school, in order to be safe, you need to keep your hands to yourself and tell the teacher if there's a problem. In the community, the message may be to not back down and to engage in a fight if necessary. We can't encourage physical fights on school grounds. So we need to acknowledge that there are different expectations depending on context and teach our students how to code switch by explicitly teaching what students should do in the case of an altercation at school. However, this student's responses to being responsible in the home and community aren't necessarily discordant with what we'd expect at school. In this case, we can actually use the students' examples and build them into our matrix. So a helpful way to think about how we can address discrepancies from the values and behaviors our school matrices espouse in comparison to the values and behaviors reinforced within their home and community is to use the acronym VAB, V-A-B-B, validation, affirmation, building, and bridging. This is a set of strategies to help our students to engage in important code switching, adapting one's behaviors to the environment around them. And this is also a skill for us to employ in having that conversation. So when we validate, we want to make sure that we legitimize aspects of students and their family's culture that have traditionally been seen as illegitimate by the dominant culture. When we affirm, we want to be sure to acknowledge the value of students' cultures and learning histories. When we build, we want to build opportunities to teach students why particular school behaviors are necessary in certain settings. And when we bridge, we give students the opportunity to practice a new skill and build in their fluency of school-specific skills. The Cultural Responsiveness Guide gives us a nice example of how VAB, V-A-B-B, can be applied on the playground to address students playing the dozens, which is a game of insults. The lesson walks teachers through steps such as validating and affirming that the students feel that the game is cool to them. It is cool, and gives them an opportunity to show their verbal strengths. It gives an opportunity to build situational appropriateness by having students identify when it is and isn't appropriate to be playing such a game. And it does bridging by teaching and practicing other ways they can be competitive and show their skills. I do suggest that you go back to that cultural responsiveness field guide to really see the full elaboration of that lesson plan. So quickly, here are the steps that we would recommend for using the personal matrix. We want to make sure, to start off, we want to ask students in general what they think are the purposes of expectations, because that might be kind of a foreign concept and might require some elaboration as to why this is important. We then want to review the school-wide expectations and specific examples with the students. Ask students to write down multiple examples of how they would follow expectations at home and within their community. We want them to ask students to write down multiple examples of how their friends expect them to behave. Ask students to share similarities and differences between those settings. And we even want to engage them in conversation about what strategies we can use to encourage appropriate behaviors and discourage the violations of those behaviors. You'll be surprised with what kind of ideas come out of our own students. So take a moment to review the personal matrix activity and think about how you could apply this within your own school. Take some notes and bring your ideas back to the team for consideration. As you look towards building out your expectations, you may want to consider these readings and resources, including readings, definitions, and a video relative to the validate, affirm, build, and bridge strategy, the VAB strategy. There's a monograph specific to the application of PBIS and career and college readiness that Christine was talking about. There's a monograph looking at trends in the implementation of PBIS in high school, especially investing in freshman year, as we had talked about earlier. And there's a video and examples for how to create a behavioral matrix, including how we can create a matrix for remote instruction. The next time we meet as teams, we'll be focusing on continuing our overview of school-wide PBIS, especially focusing on systems to support staff. We'll also be continuing our getting started steps of school-wide PBIS, focusing on teaching school-wide expectations. Your tasks will be to revisit your school-wide matrix, to write your own lesson plans for teaching those expectations, to identify how you're going to teach those expectations. Are you going to teach them in classes? Are you going to teach them through videos, through stations? How are you going to employ those lessons? And what is your schedule for that? We also want to figure out how you're going to present your draft products to your broader staff and receive feedback from your staff and receive feedback from parents and from students. And finally, as a team, you'll be completing the team implementation checklist, otherwise known as the TIC. In the meantime, we'll look forward to seeing you then. Take care, and please feel free to reach out to your facilitators for technical assistance in between team and coaches sessions. Thank you so much for your time, and see you next month.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.